many subject areas, statistics have become the go-to for discussions, and although they do offer some interesting insights, they are never able to provide a full understanding of what is actually going on. They are simply data points, often lacking context and always leaving questions unanswered. Military history is no exception. Many people, myself included, love to pore over orders of battle, armaments and weapons charts, and even captured and casualty lists. But, despite their allure, none of these ever actually answer the questions as to how or why battles are won or lost. The best they can provide are indications. History is riddled with examples of the unexpected, of rookie troops defeating grizzled veterans, of small forces overcoming larger ones, or of ill-equipped troops able to hold ground against superior weaponry. There therefore must be another factor at play, an underpinning to all of this, something that statistics alone cannot chart, and that factor is, I believe, morale. Morale is of fundamental importance in war. Neither technology, however sophisticated, nor numbers are of use without the courage to employ them. But what exactly is morale? Morale, the confidence, enthusiasm, and discipline of a person or group at a particular time. In more military terms, SLA Marshal describes it as the whole concept of an army's thoughts. Although true, I feel that morale needs to be viewed as something that starts at the level of the individual soldier. It determines not only if he will fight, but also how he will fight, and from there morale shifts up through the organisation of the army, from section morale to battalion morale, regimental morale, all the way up to encompassing the entire army. If this concept of morale is so important, then the obvious question would be, why is it such a neglected topic in the area of military science, with so few books presenting a full understanding of it? The problem is that how exactly can morale be measured? Casualty numbers, rounds fired, caliber of weapons used, number of troops involved, etc. All of these factors can be quantified, often with relative accuracy, and so it is to these factors that most turn their attention and go on to use as examples as to why battles had the results that they did. Body count is much easier to understand than something fluffy like the psychology of manoeuvre. However, these factors only form part of the answer and are in fact all influencers to varying degrees upon morale. Therefore, in order to understand combat, and thus the tactics, both large and small scale, used during the Napoleonic Wars, I think that it is essential to first garner an understanding of morale and its importance, particularly upon the battlefield. In the following video, I aim to do just that, providing examples of factors that affect morale, as well as dispelling a few myths that unfortunately continue to linger about the state of combat during the period. One thing to first understand, and it is something that Leo Murray brings to life brilliantly in his book, Brains and Bullets, is the dismissal of the notion that some people are born warriors who will fight no matter the odds, whilst others are simply cowards who will always refuse to fight. This is simply not the case. Although each individual does possess varying degrees of willingness to engage in combat, given the right circumstances, almost everyone will fight, and given the wrong circumstances, even the bravest soldier will give in. When different tactical situations are compared, a platoon sometimes has half of its men being gutful, half lying down not firing, and no one making tracks for home. On another day, all the men in that same platoon will fight, or all of them will run away. When one or two shots come from a tree line, everyone in the platoon will return fire. When they swap places with the men in the tree line, and have thousands of bullets heading their way, they will all make tracks for home. These men have not had their personalities changed overnight. They have not suddenly remembered or forgotten their training. It is the tactical situation that has changed. To answer the question, who fights, is pretty much everybody. If the conditions are right, then almost any man will fight, but change those conditions and almost everybody will stop fighting. As Murray's example here illustrates, morale is not of a fixed value which men are born with, making some brave and some cowards. Its value is in constant flux, influenced by many factors both on and off the battlefield. If it sinks low enough, then even the bravest soldiers will flee, for example the Guard breaking at Waterloo. But if it is pushed high enough, then at times, even raw troops can overcome veterans. In all battles, a moment occurs when the bravest troops, after having made the greatest efforts, feel inclined to run. The Musketeer is riddled with examples of this occurring. To list but a few, the Battle of Cowpens in 1781 saw British troops soundly beaten by a combination of militia and regulars. During the 1813 and 14 campaigns, Napoleon inspired fresh conscripts, frequently referred to as the Marie Louises, to notable victories over the then reformed and veteran armies of the Sixth Coalition. And finally, at the end of the Napoleonic age, the Dutch troops under General Chasse were certainly less experienced than the Middle Guard Grenadier Battalion, which they routed at the climax of the Battle of Waterloo. However, for each of these examples to occur, there were often multiple factors affecting the morale of both sides, enabling the advantage to shift one way or another, allowing for these, on paper at least, unlikely events to occur. It is also important to realise that morale is not just a binary measurement of whether a soldier, regiment or army will either stand their ground or run away, it is also an indication of their overall combat effectiveness. Shaken and low morale troops, whilst they may not immediately rout, will have a lower combat effectiveness than if they were fresh and in high spirits. This can affect even what might appear as trivial things such as accuracy, rate of fire, or willingness to close the distance to the enemy, but all of which can make a huge difference upon the battlefield. Let us then discuss some of these factors and explain how they may potentially impact upon morale, and the obvious place to start are the sights and sound of the battlefield itself. Artillery is regarded by many soldiers as being some of the most terrifying fire to endure, its noise tremendous and at times even shaking the ground. According to Colonel von Umtida, one of the greatest trials of patience was to look on passively at a cannonade which was pretty lively. During the Napoleonic period, battlefield artillery primarily fired a combination of shells, which exploded with loud bangs, round shot, balls of lead varying in size depending on the caliber of the cannon from which they were fired, and case shot consisting of a container of numerous smaller lead balls which scattered upon firing, creating a shotgun-like spread, deadly at closer ranges. All would be terrifying to endure, but round shot was perhaps one of the most intimidating, with direct hits often crashing into units, taking out multiple files, mangling limbs, and leaving behind the screams and groans of men mutilated by its passing. Worse was having to endure ricocheted fire, where the ball, visible to the naked eye, would bounce off the ground towards the men. One British observer compared it to a cricket ball bouncing towards you. It wasn't just artillery fire which the soldier had to deal with, however. Those subjected to musket fire had to endure similar experience. It was extremely nerve-wracking to be subjected to even small arms fire. Although the muskets of the period are famed for their supposed inaccuracy, they were still deadly, and especially to the nerves, as hearing the air fill with the whiz of musket balls as they fly past unsettles and compels almost all but the most experienced and disciplined troops to duck their heads ever so slightly. Even independent fire from skirmishers could be grueling, especially if the defenders were denied the opportunity to fire back at such low priority targets. However, although these factors all impact morale, it is never clear nor precise as to the exact amount, hence the difficulty in both understanding and explaining this crucial part of warfare. For starters, enduring any of these factors will obviously have a negative impact upon a unit's morale, but conversely, watching your enemy endure such things will often increase the morale of a unit. Napoleon, for example, realized this phenomenon when he declared, "The worse the troops are, the more guns they require." This was spoken in the context of the campaign on the Danube in 1809, where Napoleon, facing a resurgent Austria and with much of his own Grande Armée occupied in Spain, was forced to call up many new recruits. He therefore deemed it prudent to reintroduce battalion guns. Small in calibre and few in number, these were found to have little effect upon the enemy, but their noise and discharge boosted the morale of the troops amongst which they were distributed. Another factor concerning these battlefield issues is that the effect felt by troops will differ depending upon their quality and experience. Veterans of multiple battles and campaigns, for example, will have their morale impacted less by many of these factors when compared to troops facing their very first battle. Even further into this equation can also be thrown the individual motivation of the soldier. A volunteer would perhaps be more willing to endure these factors than a conscript, but a strong esprit de corps, as well as a strong sense of belonging and pride within a unit, can also impact this motivation, as Lynn explains. A sense of union with his comrades assured the common soldier that he did not face the enemy alone, and that he could count upon the weapons and the care of his fellows. There are, however, group standards to be met if an individual is to retain the respect of the group. Standards of manliness, responsibility, and proficiency inherited from the civil society and military environs are enforced by the group. Unit identification can also give rise to self-confidence, pride, and elitism. Unit self-confidence grows as either training or experience leads the soldier to see his unit as capable of performing its tasks. Unit pride can come from proven ability, but can also come from pride in the unit's traditions and history. In fact, as Gates comments, even the uniforms that the soldiers wore could impact morale. The flamboyant uniforms of the time also played their part in making men forget their own vulnerability and feel bigger, stronger, and braver than they actually were. Epaulets made narrow shoulders look broader, while a shako helmet, or above all, a bearskin bonnet, added stature. This effect could not only inspire the man wearing it, but also instill fear into his enemy, as experienced by the British soldiers facing the middle guard during the famous final attack at Waterloo, with many men commenting in memoirs and letters home the intimidating sight of the guard, already tall men wearing tall bearskins marching lockstep with shouldered arms towards them. The Russian guard had a similar effect upon Lady Burgesh when she witnessed them on parade. A sight too magnificent to be described, the extreme care and cleanliness of their dress is quite beautiful. All gigantic, they are composed of the tallest men in Russia, their coats are all padded to stuff out their chests and widen their shoulders, and therefore they really look like statues. These are just a few of the factors that can affect morale, as many others, both on and off the battlefield, can also have an impact. Issues such as terrain, weaponry, fatigue, results of previous conflicts, etc. And of course, most, if not all of the factors affecting morale, exert influence on each other. For example, soldiers who are marching from victory to victory are less likely to feel fatigue than those on the losing side. However, there is indeed one factor, which in some ways links many of these other issues together, and that is leadership. Whilst they may not have understood the precise notion of the psychology at play, the greatest commanders have always intuitively understood this notion of morale, and they use their powers to influence it, either by boosting the morale of their own men, or by reducing that of their enemies, or, best of all, by doing both simultaneously. Unsurprisingly, Napoleon, as in most aspects of warfare, was a master of this manipulation of morale. He understood the importance of esprit de corps, handing each regiment an eagle to bear and protect, whilst their flags were adorned with battle honours unique to the regiment. Rewards of titles and medals instilled courage and devotion, with each soldier believing that in each of their knapsacks sat their own marshal's baton, simply waiting to be won through valour and glory. Being a soldier himself, Napoleon would also converse with many of the common troops, appearing to show an interest in their well-being and opinions, whilst also offering personal praise, utilising his apt memory for faces. Whether any of this was genuine or not was irrelevant, because these stories quickly spread around the army, giving the feeling that the emperor not only valued the men, but that he was still one of them. Most soldiers in most armies have at best only a partial understanding of the causes and goals of the war they are fighting, but they do have a sense of whether or not their efforts are valued. As regards to his enemy's morale, Napoleon's battlefield prowess was so feared by the enemy generals that during the 1813 and 14 campaigns, the Allied commanders, unless united together, simply refused to give battle if they knew Napoleon was opposing them. There is also a reason why Wellington referred to the Emperor's hat as being worth 40,000 men, for Napoleon also understood how to utilise his presence to rally and inspire the fighting men during battle. An example being at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, where, with the left wing crumbling and beginning to fall back, Napoleon mounted Euphrates, his snow-white Persian horse, and traversed the battle line from end to end. His mere presence halted the fugitives. Retracing his steps, he carried them forward again under heavy fire. There is sometimes a belief that commanders of the age spent their time on the battlefield safely out of harm's way, overseeing proceedings from the rear, but this was rarely the case. At Waterloo, Wellington spent the entire day mounted, riding from position to position, both to supervise events and to maintain morale. As a testament to the danger he faced, by battle's end almost his entire staff had been either killed or wounded, and it was a minor miracle that he himself was unharmed. Napoleon was also exposed to danger many times throughout his many years campaigning, and although avoiding major injury, he was wounded several times. One of the first times since becoming emperor was during the storming of Ratisbon in 1809, where Napoleon was hit in the foot by a piece of canister. The news spread like wildfire throughout the aghast army, but Napoleon lost no time in mounting his horse in spite of considerable pain and rode up and down the lines, showing himself to the men and bestowing a considerable number of decorations on deserving soldiers as he passed. Confidence and morale were immediately restored. During the same battle, we also witness an example of the frontline leadership style that was common throughout the period from Marshal Lynn. After 2 failed assaults by volunteers drawn from Moran's division had failed in a costly fashion, no further troops would step forward and take the scaling ladders in hand. Then the intrepid Lynn exclaimed, "Oh well, I am going to prove to you that before I was a marshal, I was a grenadier, and so I still am." He seized the ladder, picked it up, and started to carry it toward the breach. At the sight of this, the division was re-energized and quickly followed the marshal, resulting in the capturing of the town. In a basic sense, the troops' level of faith in their commander makes a huge difference on both the small as well as the grand scale. A battalion's success and therefore ultimate safety in combat was reliant upon their commanding officer's ability to make correct decisions, for example, ordering their forming square when threatened by cavalry, or ordering them to fire at the correct time, and in other such matters. Therefore, having the faith in their commanding officer to do this assuredly raises morale, but doubts can erase it very quickly. Marshal Ney in his Memoirs recognized this, noting, "I think that it would not be useless to advise colonels of infantry regiments to avoid, with the greatest care, a reverse at the opening of a campaign. The least check has more influence than is generally supposed upon the remaining operations of the campaign. It diminishes the confidence of the men by raising mistrust of the commander's talents. The least success, on the contrary, impresses upon the troops, from the very beginning, that just military pride which doubles their strength and serves as a presage of a series of brilliant feats." Likewise, the commander himself had to understand his men and their morale, as well as the tactical situation, combining both factors together in order to make the correct decision. An example of this being General Kellerman, commanding the 3rd Cavalry Corps during the Battle of Quatre Bras, who was ordered by Marshal Ney to charge the Anglo-Allied army, 20,000 strong, with just 800 of his cuirassiers. Under usual circumstances, the French cavalry charged at no faster than a trot, preferring order to speed, but given the situation, Kellerman judged it better to order the charge at the gallop, so as to spare his men the realization of the hopeless situation facing them. Referring to himself in the 3rd person as Count Valmy, he explains, "Count Valmy launched himself like a devoted servant of death at the head of 800 cuirassiers, and, without giving them time to realize and reflect on the extent of the danger, led them, lost men, into a gulf of fire." In order for any tactical procedure to be of use, it has to be doable under the extremely stressful conditions that inevitably arise on the battlefield. Here, doable goes beyond the physical limitations of the weaponry, but refers also to what the average soldier could do or endure once he found himself in the thick of the fighting. Furthermore, the best commanders understood, perhaps only intuitively, how to utilize tactics not only to boost the morale of their own troops, but also to reduce that of the enemy. On a purely psychological level, those tactics which proved the most successful on the battlefield were those that tended to impart a positive psychological effect on those employing them, and a negative impact on those against whom it was being directed. To extend upon this idea of utilizing tactics in order to manipulate morale, we must move to what are usually referred to as more grand tactics, and in the Napoleonic era this involved the effective combination of the 3 major arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, as Arnold explains. On the Napoleonic battlefield, the tactical objective was to place the opposing infantry, the only arm capable of gaining and holding ground, in a terrible dilemma by attacking with a combined arms assault. Such an assault features a coordinated effort by the 3 arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. If confronted by all 3, there was no single formation a defender could employ to resist effectively. Although he is absolutely right about the defender being unable to select the optimal formation, the idea of combined arms is even more subtle than this and plays upon the psychology of the enemy. It is about giving the defender too much information to process, too many decisions to make, thus increasing the chances that they freeze, which then usually leads, ideally, to retreat or surrender. Combined arms works in much the same way. 2 or more threats create too much information and cause conflict between response options. But combined arms cannot be separated from speed, or they would, by definition, be uncombined arms. That last line is key, and two examples provide us with the difference in the effectiveness between combined and disjointed actions between the three arms. The first takes us to the climax of the Battle of Marengo, where the Austrians, confident of victory and very much in the ascendancy at this point, are advancing upon the French. However, the timely and fortunate arrival of Desaix's corps brings fresh troops, and the infantry are first thrown forward to halt the Austrian advance. Initially they are met with a thunderous volley from their Austrian counterparts, but fortunately Marmont brings forward the remaining guns and unleashes several rounds of canister, wavering the Austrian ranks. It is at this moment that the final arm, the cavalry, plays its role. Once again, General Kellerman is facing overwhelming odds, but this time his foe has been engaged by infantry and mauled by canister, and into the flank of 6,000 Austrians, Kellerman's mere 200 cavalry meet little resistance, shattering the already wavering forces, capturing and cutting down many men, and helping to turn the battle from a defeat into a French victory. In stark contrast, at the Battle of Waterloo 15 years later, we find Marshal Ney failing to combine the three arms, first committing cavalry into several charges, each of which, without support, are easily repulsed. Then, once infantry are eventually brought forward, it is again a solo venture, the cavalry at this point being worn out, and they too are easily repulsed. As with all things on a battlefield, there is no hard and fast rule which determines morale. The scales are ever shifting, and almost everything imaginable can affect it, even the weather. Although impossible to ever accurately quantify, it is a factor that should always be considered when evaluating the events of the period, as it usually garners a clearer understanding of the situation. Now that we have discussed the principles of the psychology involved, it is time to dispel two particular myths that have developed around the nature of combat during the Napoleonic period. Unfortunately, Hollywood has had a tendency to glorify and dramatize this combat, with recent efforts seeming to fall very short indeed of accurately portraying events that took place upon Napoleonic battlefields. The first myth is that of close combat, particularly surrounding the cult of the bayonet. Generally, it was the threat of the bayonet, and not the actual clash that decided an issue. After studying the casualties suffered by units in a number of hand-to-hand combats, Surgeon General Leray of the Grand Army found only 5 bayonet wounds and concluded that the effect of the weapon was primarily psychological. And one of Wellington's senior medical officers, George J. Guthrie, asserted that formed regiments charging with the bayonet never meet and struggle hand-to-hand and foot-to-foot, and this for the best possible reason, that one side turns and runs away as soon as the other comes close enough to do mischief. The observations of the medical men are supported by experienced officers. It was generally recognized that in open ground, regardless of the determination of both sides, one side or the other would inevitably break before the attacker and defender were able to cross bayonets. This is not to say that no one in an open field was ever killed or wounded by the bayonet. There were many such casualties. However, these did not occur because both sides stood their ground and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Almost always, bayonet wounds were inflicted during the pursuit after one side turned their backs and attempted to flee. Whilst these statements may initially be difficult to believe, especially given the tendency for multiple nations and histories to glorify the use of the bayonet, when one considers the psychology of the soldier, as well as the nature of most Napoleonic battlefields, this rarity of actual hand-to-hand combat begins to make sense. Although not always the case, I think that it is fair to say that generally a soldier possesses a certain degree of common sense when it comes to the notion of his own personal safety. No matter how brave, he knows that he would have no chance of defeating an advancing enemy battalion on his own, least of all in close combat. Therefore he understands that his safety in open ground relies primarily upon his unit and its cohesiveness. Should the morale of the unit start to fade, and therefore the cohesion start to crumble, the weakest men will naturally start to move to the rear ranks, before finally the flight response wins over, and they fall back. When this starts to occur, the next weakest will follow them, and this pattern cascades until the unit as a whole falls back, as eventually even the bravest man realizes that he cannot face the enemy alone, and will have to fall back. Regardless of a soldier's courage or foolhardiness, individuals deserted by the remainder of their unit could never stand up to an enemy formation which remained intact. And, since a formation on one side or the other invariably broke before the opposing groups closed to hand fighting, those that would have been otherwise inclined to stand and fight were drawn along in the sudden but irreversible torrent to the rear. Hand-to-hand combat could only occur as soon as something on the battlefield changed the soldier's focus from his being part of a group to that of an individual fighter. As long as the battalion remained in open terrain, there was an insurmountable tendency for each individual soldier to identify with the formation as a whole. From the soldier's perspective, his continued safety depended upon the cohesion of his unit. Although the battalion might stand even though some of its men attempted to flee to the rear, on open ground the most resolute of soldiers was immediately compelled to retire as soon as the formation itself started to dissolve. There will be some of you watching, I'm sure, that at this point will be thinking of clear examples in memoirs and other accounts where hand-to-hand combat is recorded as taking place, and to answer that question I will repeat the first line of the previous quotation. Hand-to-hand combat could only occur as soon as something on the battlefield changed the soldier's focus from his being part of a group to that of an individual fighter. Hand-to-hand combat certainly did take place during the period, but as Nosworthy shrewdly notes, something had to change within the psyche of the soldier for it to take place. This change would often be brought about by a disruption to the formation because of broken terrain, and it had two key effects which enabled, and in some ways even encouraged, close combat to take place. The first effect was that, by breaking up the unit's cohesion, a soldier could no longer rely upon formations for his protection, and instead sought it elsewhere. For example, if a unit is pushed into a woods, loose order becomes a necessity, and somewhat naturally, the soldier now finds protection from the trees and the undergrowth around him. Similarly, if entering a hamlet or a village, once again loose order prevails, and the walls and buildings provide the cover and protection for the soldier. As a soldier placed his safety in physical objects around him, he correspondingly placed less importance on a formation. Although it is clear that the soldier's protection has changed, it still does not explain why close combat is not just enabled, but encouraged in this broken terrain, as, if threatened by the bayonet, the soldier would surely forgo his new protection and still retire. However, broken terrain offers another factor, the closing of distance. Throughout history there has always been a last safe moment for a soldier in battle, a distance beyond which the soldier understands that his safety is in serious jeopardy. For a spearman this might have been 5 meters, for a modern soldier perhaps 50 meters, but for an early 19th century soldier it was probably around 20 meters. Many factors decide the distance at which this last safe moment takes effect, weaponry being one of them, but terrain is very often the key factor involved. During the musket era, in open terrain, very often both sides would stop at the edge of this last safe moment and begin to trade volleys. Then, if one side dared to break this invisible barrier and close the distance, then very often, sensing the growing danger, the side with the weaker morale would break, as we've just discussed. However, in close terrain, the situation is different. The engagement ranges are very often much nearer, and as a consequence, the last safe moment is also much closer to the enemy. Often in this kind of terrain, men will unwittingly pass this last safe moment, almost stumbling into the enemy and encountering them at such a range that they enter a point of no return, leaving them with limited options. If men pass through the last safe moment, they appear to reach a point of no return. It is very clear that running or stalling will probably get them killed, so their only options are to fight or try to surrender. With only 2 viable options, this greatly increases the chances that men will fight once they get to within a few meters of each other. As highlighted earlier, Murray believes that it is not so much the nature of the man that determines his willingness to fight, but the situation that he finds himself in, and he elaborates this in regards to this point of no return. At the last safe moment, the number of men who actually fight drops to a quarter of that for a long-range exchange of fire, but then, at the point of no return, the number of fighting jumps back up to the level we see in a firefight. This is where and why close combat could and certainly did occur during this period. When terrain breaks up the formation and provides the soldier with something to defend and to view his protection in, he will naturally cling to it. Therefore, when this is combined with the closing of the last safe moment and the limited options available beyond this point of no return, close hand-to-hand combat often took place, and it was as brutal and as bloody as can be imagined, usually resulting in very high casualties for both sides involved. To list only a few examples, one sees such carnage at the Battle of Lynn during the taking and retaking of the 2 villages, as well as during the struggle for the Great Redoubt at the Battle of Borodino in 1812. There are indeed many more examples of close combat taking place throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, but as shown, it took a certain set of circumstances for it to occur, and it therefore was rarely the outcome when 2 units met on an open field, nor was it as frequently occurring as Hollywood would have us believe. The second myth revolves around cavalry and their impact on the battlefield. It appears that there is a lingering idea that cavalry, particularly heavy cavalry, would smash through enemy infantry formations, crashing through lines of troops if they caught them in any formation except square, but this was not the case. What must be remembered is that a horse is not like a bicycle or a car. It has a mind and a will of its own, and, much like the self-preservation that keeps a man from standing alone once his unit is broken, a horse will not be forced to crash into what is effectively a brick wall just because the rider wills it on. It will stop when faced with something it cannot get through, and charging at an enemy formation of 3-rank line is no different than charging a side of a square. The reason that a square is the default option for infantry when facing cavalry is because it cannot be outflanked. It is the same reason why skirmishers, when caught in the open by cavalry, attempted to form rallying squares, most usually resembling small circles of men, for their protection. The idea was to present an enclosed wall of bayonets to deter the horses, whilst preventing flank or rear attacks. As in the infantry versus infantry engagements discussed earlier, when cavalry charges infantry, it is once again a battle of morale. Against well-formed infantry, who are confident and unwavered in their formation, cavalry rarely, if ever, is able to break them. However, should the same cavalry catch the same infantry unaware, either in the flank or rear, or perhaps in the process of reloading or changing formation, then the morale superiority now favours the cavalry, and the infantry's formation may start to disintegrate as men begin to flee, exposing the infantry to certain defeat. An example of this would be the disaster of Colborne's brigade at the Battle of Albura, where, upon exposing their flank and rear to enemy cavalry, the result was carnage, with one battalion of the Buffs being reduced from a starting strength of around 750 men to just 85 by battle's end. They had already endured artillery fire, infantry charges, and hand-to-hand infantry combat, and now enemy cavalry had caught them unawares. If discipline is the glue which makes a mob into an efficient fighting force, fear is the solvent which can reverse the transformation. The men of Colborne's brigade seem to have had 3 primary responses to their predicament. Many, perhaps most, fled for their lives, with or without their weapons. Others banded together in clusters with bayonets facing outwards, hoping to achieve a semblance of the solidity of the prescribed square formation by a sheer mass of bodies. A last group simply surrendered, attempting to avoid their extraordinary peril by formally declaring themselves vanquished. For similar reasons, cavalry-on-cavalry engagements do not result in an equestrian-style car crash when both parties charge headlong into each other. Instead, one of 3 things usually occurred. Firstly, and connected with morale in the same sense as infantry facing one another, one side may break and flee, with the victors usually then chasing after them. The Prussian charge doctrine was designed to buoy the troopers' morale so that they would run headlong into the enemy cavalry. Of course, in practice this rarely, if ever, occurred. Ardan Dupic, the brilliant French tactical analyst writing prior to the Franco-Prussian War, estimated that 49 times out of 50, one side hesitated, became disordered, then fled before any actual contact was made. Conversely, both sides may simply stop several yards from each other as the horses, and often the riders, sensing the crash, pull up. An excellent example of this type of occurrence was provided in the Peninsular War during the retreat of the British Army from Burgos in 1812. A French force of 3 squadrons of French chasseurs cheval encountered several squadrons of the British rear guard, somewhere between Villadrigo and Villatropega. Each side deployed along the traditional 2 lines and then advanced at the charge, but at the last moment the 2 forces pulled up so that they stood facing one another. For a few moments both groups were motionless, until a French cavalryman made a swipe at the English rider opposite him. Immediately everyone else plunged forward and a general melee ensued. The British finally beat off the French, who suffered heavy casualties, including the death of their colonel. Finally, each side may open their files, allowing the formations to pass through each other, with much slashing and hacking occurring as they did. This method usually only occurred when the forces had sufficient time to act, therefore close combat in this sense between cavalry was much more likely when both forces advanced at no more than the trot, which in reality happened much more often than, once again, Hollywood would have us believe. As opposed to the theoretical model employing a charge at speed, in actual practice many heavy and medium cavalry regiments during the Napoleonic Wars only charged at the trot, or even a fast walk. When both sides employed a slower gait during the charge, such as a trot or walk, the likelihood of actual contact was greatly increased. This does not mean that charging at full speed never occurred. It absolutely did, with Kellerman's charge at Quatre Bras being a prime example, but it was by no means the norm. Despite Frederick the Great seeming to revolutionize cavalry combat by emphasizing speed in order to win the Battle of Morale, by the Napoleonic period many of the great cavalry commanders understood that, like their infantry counterparts, formation was more important than intensity. The boot-to-boot tight formation is usually only associated with heavy cavalry, but Lasalle, arguably the finest light horse commander of the period, utilized and understood its importance, commenting upon the sight of Austrian horses charging at the full gallop towards his formation that they were lost men. As a great final example which shows both the reluctance of horses to run into anything and the importance of formation in regards to cavalry upon cavalry, as well as the impact of morale, I want to bring up an example from, I believe, the 1813 campaign in Germany. I say believe because frustratingly, when I read about this example, for once I didn't write it down, and despite searching high and low I can't seem to locate the book in which I read it in to find the exact quotes. It is too good an example not to mention, however, so please excuse any inaccuracy, though the general notion is still relevant. During this battle, the French Villette cavalry of the Guard were in their first ever encounter, and, standing in line, they were attacked head-on by more experienced Austrian cavalry, who approached at the gallop, hoping to scare the raw troops into retreating. Fortunately for the French, behind the Villette stood a much more senior regiment, the experienced and elite Imperial Guard Chasseurs Cheval, who encouraged the rookies to draw their sabres, point them forward, and hold their ground, staying boot to boot, with the warning that if they flinched they would be overrun. Fortunately they didn't, and predictably, as discussed above, the Austrian cavalry, despite their tenacity, were forced to pull up just short of the solid line of horses and sabres facing them. Having lost all sense of order, and with their horses blown from such a pell-mell charge, the Austrians were now vulnerable, and, encouraged by the chasseurs, the Villettes now countercharged the Austrians, forcing them to flee, and cutting down and capturing many of them before they could return to their own lines. Morale, because of its vague nature, is difficult to define and often undervalued by military historians, but hopefully through this video I have shown it is arguably the key factor in determining the outcome of engagements. The aim of combat is to break the morale of the opponent, and thus force them to either surrender or retire. This is accomplished by many factors, and different tactics and formations are merely tools used for accomplishing this goal. They are not predeterminates, nor is the interaction between the three arms and their formations a game of rock, paper, scissors, as most war games and video games make it out to be. I am not criticizing them here. I am a wargamer myself, and the John Tiller games are still to this day some of my favourites, but it is important to understand that the realities of warfare are far more complex. As a quick for instance, there are many examples of infantry, though caught out of square, able to comfortably defeat enemy cavalry. An example being the British 28th Foot during the Battle of Alexandria. Part of the French cavalry wheeled to the left and charged into the open rear of the redoubt, pouring in behind the 28th, who were under heavy infantry attack from the front. "Rear rank 28th, right about face," shouted Colonel Chambers. The rear rank turned about on the parapet and fired a single volley inside the redoubt which destroyed the attackers. Throughout history, the best leaders in all fields, not just military, have understood this notion of morale, whether intrinsically or through experience and reflection, and have manipulated and utilized its effects for their own advantage. Often this is addressed as confidence, flow state, or other such names, but the overall principle is morale. It is a key aspect of psychology that few have taken the time to study and dissect. Over the next few videos I intend to explore the tactics used during the period, but I felt that an understanding of morale would be useful, as it is the linchpin that holds much of the tactical debate together. The next video will look into why the British were able to beat the French when no one else seemingly could, and again it is morale that played the key role. Until then, thanks for watching.